This idea of forming clubs that you're either in or out is exclusionary, and it's contrary to good practice. The very practice of what we do as scientists and information analysts is to go out and collect data from as wide a spectrum as possible and test it for its relevance to our field.
Hi everybody, welcome back. On today's episode of the pod, Howard would like to lead us into the topic of professionalisation. So I'm going to let him go into more detail. So Howard, just take it away.
Yes. Hello everybody. The reason I wanted to talk about this is throughout the podcasts that Mark and I have done already, we've talked a lot about developing your skills as an intel operative, data scientist, analyst, however you want to refer to yourself. And I'm personally a big believer in that, personal development in every sense of the word. Even now, at the age that I'm at and in retirement, there's not a day goes by when I'm not trying to learn something new and enjoying that process. It kind of floats my boat. Now, when I came into the intelligence process or profession, and no pun intended, there was a role within the organisation that I worked within, but it wasn't well defined. There was zero training for it, to my surprise. When I looked at what the role entailed and how potentially important it could be in influencing decision makers. And in my specific case, I joined my home force as a uniformed police officer, lowest grade, as all police officers do in the UK, or did at that time. There was no coming in partway up the ranks. I did my basic training, if you want to call it that, and early service in uniform, but my aspiration was always to be a detective. And I was lucky. I proved the ability on the ground so that I was given a chance to work as what they call in UK policing an aide. That's somebody loaned to a detective department. As an aide, you were loaned to a CID, a criminal investigation department, to work with detectives so they could assess whether or not you were any good. And if you kind of passed that acid test on the ground, you would get supported to go on a initial training course to be a detective, which was a 12-week course. I did. I completed that, and I came back to my division, back into uniform, waiting for a job as a detective. And the waiting list at that time was 2 years. So there I am, patiently waiting, working in uniform. But then there was a national inspection of my home force that said, well, we don't think you have enough female or ethnic minorities in your detective departments, your team profile, if you will, across the force. And the force's reaction to that was a knee-jerk. It quickly looked around the force for people who fit those minority groups, and they were parachuted into the detective department, whether or not they wanted to be detectives. Not their fault. Good luck to them. And it was an understandable move by the force. But it meant that people like me got pushed back, who were quietly waiting. But then I got a phone call out of the blue from a former supervisor who had become the head of the force intelligence unit in my force to say, would you like to have a role as a detective in intelligence? And he offered me 2 jobs, but said the one he wanted me to do was to be the deputy force analyst. There were 2 force analysts, a lead analyst and a deputy, both of which were detectives at that time. The lead analyst was a detective sergeant. I would have been detective constable. And I said, yes, please.
Can I just pause you there for our non-law enforcement listeners? So just to recap, so you've joined as a police officer. The police officer to become a police officer, you had to, did you go to Hendon or did you go, where did you go for your training?
I actually attended Dishforth, which is an RAF airfield or an ex-RAF airfield in North Yorkshire. Across the UK, there are many, or at that time there were many, what they call regional training centres.
Mm-hmm.
Hendon is the one that people know because it's linked to the Metropolitan Police.
Sure.
But there were probably half a dozen around the UK. And in my case, from being up north, I went to Dishforth. But you always did some training in your home force. And then, of course, you went back to your home force after your national training course.
As a probationer, right? That's
as a probationer. For 2
years. And how long were you on probation for?
Every police officer, the standard is 2 years minimum.
It's 2 years. So, and how long was the course at Dishforth?
I think it was 12 weeks.
12 weeks. So what we're saying is to become a professional police officer at that point in time, back in 81, 82, 83, you've done a 12-week course. You've then gone back on a probationary period to see, okay, you've learned the theory. Now you're learning the practice, and they're keeping an eye on you, right? To make sense.
Yes. For those 2 years, you are walking the streets, doing the job of a police officer. You are a police officer.
Sure.
But you are being taught on the job by more experienced police officers.
And you, a number of years in, thought, okay, I want to make the detective jump. And could you just maybe elaborate for people, not law enforcement, what CID is? I don't have to be the history of detectives, but just in general terms, how do you make the leap internally from police officer uniform to detective CID? Why is that there?
Yeah. Like all jobs, within big organisations, there are loads of opportunities to specialise, but until you get into those organisations, you're not always aware of A, that they exist, or B, what they are. And that was certainly my experience coming into the police as a career. I hadn't planned for it. It was a reaction to there being no jobs in science, which I'd trained for and gone to university for. This was just a way to make a living with a reliable income and a pension and, all the things that drive you outside doing something just that you want to do for a career. And I loved it. I'm not complaining, but it wasn't chosen for reasons of it being what I wanted to do. It was purely almost a business decision. Having joined the police, then you see the other departments. You see the mounted police riding around on horses. You see the motorbike police. You see the motorway police or traffic police driving cars round. We didn't have a helicopter then, but you saw the community constables who were working with local communities. And you also saw the big element within the police that's the biggest difference, perhaps, the detectives, the officers who work in plain clothes, whose major responsibility and prime responsibility is purely to investigate and detect and prevent crime. Now, that's not to say uniformed officers don't do that. They do. But crime and criminal law can be a very complex thing and a hard thing to do. Hence, it's more efficient for people to specialise in that. And that became my specialism, as it turned out, for most of the rest of my career, except in the police, when you get promoted, they tend to put you back into uniform. So you go through that uniform process at the next rank and the next rank. And that's no bad thing, because it keeps your skills grounded and relevant and broad. At the end of the day, every police officer is the same as another police officer in terms of the powers. But the one for me was investigating and detecting crime.
So apologies, I took on a slight tangent there. But so you get this phone call, you have an opportunity to become a detective, deputy force analyst, I think you said?
And the reason I took it wasn't because I thought, yes, analysis is the way forward for me. The police didn't know about it. I took it because the senior officer who'd been an inspector at the first police station I worked at when I was a probationer in uniform had seen something in me. And he asked me, and it's very rare, or it used to be very rare in policing, for somebody of that rank. I didn't even work on his shift, so I wasn't part of his team. But he'd obviously seen something in me and put that away in his back pocket, thinking that officer has got some skills or something about him that I can maybe use later on. And it was flattering. I mean, yes, okay, I had a science degree, so I had a discipline in terms of analysis with a small a. I was used to doing analysis, but I hadn't really exhibited that in the police. It was just on a CV rather than something that I was using every day visibly. So I took the job. It made me a detective. It actually ended up taking my career in a completely different direction and actually was a significant barrier, with hindsight, to my career as a detective. I'm not complaining, but it's always interesting to look at how choices in your life can lead to, shall we say, forks in a road or in your path. Later on, certainly in my service, I found I was viewed as behind other detectives, and certainly in career progression terms I was, although my influence far exceeded that of other more experienced and more senior detectives until much later in my service. But hey, that's the way the cookie crumbles, You buy the lottery ticket and off you go. But as I say, what surprised me was the lack of training, the lack of an idea of a career progression or development for a role where I was every day analysing data on behalf of the command team, the most senior people, the board, if you will, of my home force. And I would go into meetings with them and they would explain a problem to me and I would brief them or go away and research and report back to them. Now, for a constable who's got less than 2 years' service to have the ear of the chief constable, the deputy chief constable, and a team of 6 or 7 assistant chief constables, that's quite a big step. And it taught me a lot about command structures and decision making, how people at the top of a pyramid of other layers of people and information systems and other decision makers, they're not making direct decisions based on direct information. They're getting it fed fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh hand, if that makes sense.
Can I just come in at that point? So I think we are going to get to, I know you're wanting to take us towards the professionalisation side, but I think it's important to get the fundamentals right. So we've covered your background and how you got to at that point. With what you've just told me, I think it's interesting that we've got these two components of teaching you the theory and then taking you back into the organisational fold and making sure you can do it in practice. And there was a mechanism for that in uniform, a mechanism for that as a detective. I had a similar experience, although I've never been a sworn police officer. I have been in the UK what we call police staff. My process was basically I joined the police as a vetting officer. My job was to basically assist with vetting and going through background checks and things of that kind. I had some on-the-job training, but there was no sort of kind of, I didn't go away to train. But until I got into it, mine was a route into intel and analysis. I thought if I got a job in the clerical side, I could get into intel somehow. And for me as an intelligence analyst, my job came up in a local city as a volume crime analyst, and I took it. But all I had to do was pass the interview, and then I had to do the standard course. The course was the standard analytical course at the time. It was a course you know very well, and it was called the NIAT. I think. Do you co-author that? Am I making that up?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't shoot me.
Yeah.
There's a story behind that, as there is behind everything, but yes.
Yeah, but that was, if I recall correctly, that was a 3-week course, and the process was to get my badge, if you like. It was to basically say, do the 3-week course, make sure that the tutors were happy with you, and then go back and you do a year you were on this kind of different pay scale where you were one pay scale for the first year, and then if you could do the job, they brought you up a pay scale, so you were fully badged and qualified analyst. But again, we have this process of, we try and teach you a bit of theory, but we also keep an eye on you to see that you're doing what you're doing. Where does this go then for you? Where are you taking us to from the professionalisation side, from you as force analyst?
Well, the reason for my explaining me getting into it is this idea that there was nothing there when I got there. It was an empty box in terms of, we know what we want you to do. We know what skills and abilities you need to have. We know where, if you haven't got them, we know how to train you and develop you for this role. So I then got promoted out of that role. And the plan was always, you, Howard, in my case, you will become the force analyst. A direct promotion from detective constable to detective sergeant. But then politics got in the way of that. Nothing to do with me. There was a decision made by a particular senior officer to say, we don't like promoting people in role, so we'll move people. A bit like when you talk about the military, if you get promoted, you moved out of your unit just because they don't think they'll respect you at the next level. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. But that hit me. It wasn't personal. It was just a process issue for the force. So I suddenly went from expecting to be the force analyst to being a uniformed sergeant in a police station managing uniformed police officers in the back of beyond. Loved it, but it took me several years to get back towards being a detective again and also being linked to analysis. And what happened was, after 4 or 5 years had gone by, the force had realised that it needed more of an analytic function. Now, at the time, and this wasn't the whole force, this was the training school. My force's training school was very well known in the UK and globally for the training that it delivered. Not every police force has a big training school that would deal with other than its own internal requirements. We did as a big police force. And they decided that they'd send 3 officers on a training course for analysts that had been developed in America by a private company and a Kappa Life Sciences. I applied for the job when I was a uniformed sergeant still, and bearing in mind my background, I got the job one of the 3 places. So I was flown to America with my other 2 colleagues. We spent 2 weeks being trained by these non-police officers, none of them had ever worked in policing, their system of analysis. And our task was to bring it back and train it in the UK to our force and our force's customers. So
can I ask a question? Sorry. So you've already told us that obviously you went on to Dishforth. There's police training for that. There's detective training. There's official training for that. But I think it's fascinating that at this point there's this notion that there needs to be more of an analytical capacity, but obviously it's not in the UK at this point. You've had to go to the US for it. I'm just curious, any idea where that came from?
Yeah, if you look back, there were a number of reports. If you can Google them. There was the Pierce report, the Baumber, Baumber, and then the Ratcliffe report in the 70s and early 80s around how the police service needed to evolve. And within those, amongst many recommendations, they were starting to see that there would be benefits for a more structured intelligence and analysis process. I'll leave that there because you could talk all day on those. But basically, my force, and it wasn't the whole force, it was the training school seeing a business opportunity. If we could harness this new knowledge, not only would we benefit our force, but we also know the other forces will be looking for this kind of training, so we can sell it and make money. And we did actually make quite a bit of money for my home force in and amongst the job that we were doing. But what's interesting to me is that the only training that was available in the Western world was a 2-week course developed by non-police officers in North America. So again, it's not that there's any super process that law enforcement in general has generated to come up with a better practice process. And these people were not even academics. They were a private sector company. That doesn't mean they weren't competent. They were very, very competent. But we did that course, we came back, and the first thing for me was we needed to rewrite it to make it fit the UK, because this was a generic model. Secondly, it needed rewriting because it was already out of date. So we set to, the three of us, and rewrote it. And then, because we were teaching it under license, it turned out later on 2 or 3 other forces also wanted to train it because they saw our success. But we found that our version of this training became very popular globally because as law enforcement employees, we could see how we were better able to see how it would work within law enforcement than maybe the people who originally designed it, who were generalists, if you will. So we were very successful. So much so that other police forces put political pressure and basically pinched the court. They were allowed to take the course off us. And it didn't belong to me. It belonged to my home force. It was their IP. So that's what happens. Whilst all this is going on, this is forging my early career in analysis. A bit like your own journey, I'd realised I was looking for information to, well, how can I perform this professional skill better, or this skill set better within my profession as a police officer? Because that was my profession, police officer, not analyst. And there was nothing out there. It wasn't easy to find. So I realised very quickly I had to seek any information I could get. So I was looking for documents. It wasn't a case of looking online. There wasn't an online in those days. But trawling through law enforcement globally, and law enforcement has its own information systems that are secure or confidential or secret, so it's not always easy to access them, particularly across organisational and national and international boundaries, shall we say.
Because they're in physical books or secured papers or
Yes.
in people's heads.
Yes.
You can't just walk into your local library and say, give me this.
You can. It's easier now with things like Google Docs and the internet, but that stuff wasn't easy to access. What that did, that took me to professional bodies for analysis, and I happened to make contact with one, and the organisation was the International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts, IALEA. International by name, but primarily North American. It certainly was founded in North America. So here am I in the UK writing to them. I became a member, writing to them saying, I'm kind of new to the profession and I'm doing all this. And I was lucky to get a couple of mentors from that organisation. So as I learned and got access to information through them, I also found, although it was a professional body, I'd done more work practically and identified things that they hadn't identified. And certainly they weren't used to working in Europe and the UK. I had, shall we say, a different handle and a different set of resources. So to pay something back, I started writing for their journal, a quasi-academic journal. The articles were well received. They had awards processes. I won a number of awards for my work. I designed a continuing professional development workbook for analysts globally that they and I gave away for free. And I ended up being invited to become an officer with them and for them, an unpaid post, a voluntary post. And I served various offices, up to and including the second in command, if you will, the vice president. I also set up a UK chapter, a local national group that became now its own professional body outside of ILEA. It took control of itself some years later. I became members of other bodies. I tried to bring professional bodies together, and I've worked in other fields since, always as a volunteer. But what that process taught me was, whilst professionalism is important and there are some positive opportunities, it can also be quite limiting. And there are some features about it that need to be viewed with caution. I actually ended up resigning from the professional body board, but also from the professional bodies themselves, because of things that were taking place that didn't fit my view and my employer's organisation's view of ethics and proper standards. And I'm not saying there were anything criminal or anything like that. Just leave it that what they were doing didn't fit my organisation's model. And at the end of the day, I was a serving police officer, so I had standards to meet, quite rightly. My employer expected me to be an advocate and a good exemplar of their standards and their processes. And I'm quite happy with that.
So let's catch people up. The point we're trying to make so far is that we've took people down the journey of the professionalisation in post, as in how do you get certified, in your case as a police officer and then detective, and in my case as an intel analyst. And then you've touched on professional associations outside of the organisation, and you're going to now basically go through some of the where it goes wrong, the hazards, if you like, where the professional bodies kind of, when it fails.
Yeah. And this is not to be a detriment to them. I'm an avid supporter of them. I think they provide a valuable service to a number of stakeholders, but if you're not aware and the members and the officers are not aware of where the faults go, you can end up causing problems. I think professionalism within law enforcement has maybe not delivered the potential it has, and as a result, the profession of intelligence and analysis, and this is purely my personal view, I think has perhaps peaked and hit a bit of a plateau and maybe even fallen back a bit in terms of its momentum and its ability to provide a service of value to decision makers. I'm happy to be challenged on that. It's just my personal view.
Yeah, and I want to say at this point that neither you or I are seeking to offend or bother anybody by this, but we felt strongly enough, both of us independently, that there are issues, not necessarily with specific bodies, but with the paradigm overall, that there's something fundamentally wrong. And I think that's where we're going. I'm not going to let you go into your bit about what you think's wrong first. I'll come in with what I've got wrong. But like I said,
absolutely.
But what I would say is, just anybody listening, if you're part of one of those bodies and you couldn't disagree with us more, we'd love to have you on the pod. Get in touch. This is just our viewpoint. We may be flat wrong. Howard's experience is from many decades ago. My experience is a little bit more recent, but it's still a good couple of decades ago. So, it could be things are perfect now. I don't think they are, but if you want to come on and put to the pod, have a chat and offer a counterpoint, we'd absolutely welcome that. We would bite your hand off. So, Howard, back to you. Sorry.
Yeah. So if you look at professionalism, or this idea of professional, regardless of it being law enforcement, just any kind of profession, the one key attribute is you're paid for it. It's the reason you are paid. So it's not a hobby, it's not a pastime, it's something that you get a financial reward for. And if somebody's paying you, they have a right to expect something in return. That seems reasonable and fair to me. And when you look at some of the definitions around professionalism, they talk about people who have specific qualifications or training or skill sets, so that if you employ one of these professionals, that they compared to a non-professional must have those minimum skills to be called a professional. That doesn't mean that a non-professional doesn't have them. They may have more, but there's no guarantee with that. It's the Wild West, if you will. It's buyer beware. The other thing with a profession is it's a group of people. So it represents a field, usually, or a subset of a field. So there are different groups. They all look to try and have, shall we say, not only set a minimum standard for skill sets, but also have standards of ethics and good behaviour, because clearly, just because you're skilled at something doesn't mean you always do it appropriately. I know many, many excellent career criminals who are skilled. If there was a PhD, they would be doing postdoctoral work in some kind of crime. It doesn't make them ethical, moral, honest, trustworthy people to a client, a customer. The third thing is they usually offer some kind of assessment process and support of education and professional development. Because clearly, if you're going to set a standard saying people in the profession have got to have these minimum standards, one, you've got to find a way of unifying the way it's delivered to your members, and two, of assessing when they've succeeded in that professional training, or also when they fail either in their training or in their ethical behaviour or the service they deliver. So that's kind of professional bodies, whether you be in banking, medicine, and that's kind of the basic structure. Now, that's all very well, nothing wrong with that, but very few professional bodies are run by what you might call competent business people who grew up and are trained and skilled in that scenario. They tend to be fellow professionals who've grown up in that profession and become leaders in their profession. Nothing wrong with that, but a highly qualified consultant in medicine isn't automatically highly qualified in managing business finances and logistics and career development. I'm not saying they won't have some skill, but there may be better people who've been educated in those kind of processes who could support them, but they're not a member of the professional body. So you tend to end up with committees of peers. Now, the problem with that is maybe we're missing the potential of a skill set. A professional body needs somebody who's really good with finances. I've been the deputy head of a professional body. I've been on the boards of many. In my career lifetime, I've been a member and an active member of maybe 10 or 12 professional bodies connected to law enforcement intelligence analysis, and many other professional bodies and groups connected to other forms of information analysis or other areas of study that interest me. I believe in them, so I've got a fairly rounded view. But what tends to happen is that lack of skill set means that potentially they don't achieve what they might have achieved. They often are not very efficient businesses, if you want to call them that. Secondly, it's not somebody's number one career. You have to volunteer usually. So in my case, I would give all my fellow board members gave their time for free. Nothing wrong with that. It's entirely altruistic, but there's a clash between the time you devote to that compared to the time devoted to your family and domestic life, the time you devote to your professional career that you're being paid for. Something has to give. And usually out of those three, it's the professional group that is the poor relation, even if people are absolutely superb. Contrast that with somebody who's working for it full time and is devoting 24/7 of their time and or is being paid. I never received a penny, nor would I wish to, for any of the roles I had. I might be helped with expenses, to go to a meeting or something, because I can't afford to pay for it out of my pocket, and my organisation didn't pay. But I was never paid a wage or income, and that's a good thing ethically. But it also focuses the attention of board members to they have to survive, they have to, pay a mortgage and have kids. So there's a lot of drivers going on here. The last point I would make on this is they also end up becoming competitive. Now, to explain what I mean by that, there are a number of, even just within law enforcement, there are a whole range of professional bodies. Right now, I could identify about 30 globally that I know of. And I don't mean small chapters or user groups for a particular kind of software. I'm talking about major national or international bodies that are known and respected as the professional body or one of the bodies in this field. The go-tos for law enforcement, shall we say, public and private sector. The problem with them is, because they are different bodies, who are the stakeholders here? The members, the young career or pre-career people who want to consider coming into this profession and then develop, the customers, law enforcement organisations, society itself, other stakeholders, government, private sector, finance, IT, all these other potential partners. Which one do they join? And why are these all different? For fun, I had a play with good old ChatGPT, and I said to it, do me a favour, do me a list for professional bodies linked to 4 words that we often use: information, intelligence, data, and analysis. Just those 4 words. And off ChatGPT went like the good old ego, backrooms, mad scientist servant that it is, and produced a list. And it brought up what was interesting was not the list, but the categorization of that list. We had statistical and numerate data science, shall we say, institutions, even down to the Royal Institute, which is a big thing in the UK. We had loads in law enforcement, the kind of law enforcement analysis professional bodies like the one I first joined and others like that. But we had bodies in academia, we had bodies in banking and social services, we had bodies in local government, we had bodies all across the private sector. And it just made me realise that all of these people are talking about the same things that we are talking about in our corner of the profession. So for a client, when any of these professional, within law enforcement, the various professional bodies just in law enforcement are usually well aware of each other. And the relationships can be, shall we say, amicable. They're very rarely truly collaborative, because if we were fully collaborative, they'd knock down the barriers and be one association. And that would be potentially to the benefit of all. There's an argument between specialism and generalism. But what I would say is most of the things we do are actually generic skill sets. Ethics is a generic skill set. Honesty is a generic skill set. Data analysis is a generic skill set. So we ought to be a lot more broad-minded and, shall we say, have this open church, this round table of bringing people in and for their perspectives. And if we did that, you'd have a better chance of unifying standards of training, career development, ethics, all the rest of it, employment. And that's just law enforcement. There are very, very few law enforcement professional bodies, in my experience, that ever thought about talking to professional bodies from the banking sector or academia or the IT sector or business. You see what I'm saying? So for me, that's my argument against professional bodies. It's not that they're not trying to do something noble and important, and they are a great first step for budding analysts and career analysts. Ultimately, they're destined to fail because they're not representative. Imagine if there were 500 versions of the internet. Which one do we use? Because if you had to use 500, it wouldn't be the internet. It would be something else, and it wouldn't be connected. It's the fact that it's the internet. That's the place we all have to go. It has loads of little corners and, shall we say, cupboards and little wormholes within it, but it is a global phenomenon. And I think there's a strong argument for professionalism, forget professional bodies, but people who want to be professional in the way that they approach their paid career and their development, to have a globalized standard that exploits the best knowledge and best practice in, regardless of discipline, if it's relevant, and avoids some of the worst mistakes, or shall we say, dead ends that professions sometimes go.
So to recap, what we're saying is professional organisations or associations can fail because of it's not the day job. So there's a lack of professionalism there. They can fail because of politics and issues and people not getting on. And they can potentially fail because of the commercial interests or the competition involved. I would support everything you've just said. I would say, to me, so again, not seeking to pick on any one individual or group here. Some people may recognise where I'm talking about, but I've seen this, but it occurs across the piece. So your point about, are there a million associations out there? Yes, there are. When I was getting involved in intel analysis for the first time, I had quite a lot of imposter syndrome. I wanted to know what the fundamentals were. And the problem I have with these associations is, to me, they fall into one of two groups. The first groups are what I think of as guilds. And by a guild, I'm talking old school. Like, if you look at the history of guilds, I mean, there's debates about when they first started, but I think the widely accepted view is, I think there's cited material from the 7th century. Trade guilds, literally carvings where there's a relationship between the monarchy and it might be the guild of weavers, or it might be the guild of potters or something like that in India. And those type of guilds have control over who enters the profession. They have control over the standards in the profession, and they have a relationship with the state, as in there's some sort of relationship where it might be in law. If you want to be a weaver or potter, or if you want to meet a certain standard, they've got the backup of the state at the time. That's the guild. The second type of organisation, I think, is a club. And I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but essentially it doesn't have any relationship with the state. There's no kind of regulatory power there. It doesn't have any sort of, it may have controls of entry to the club, but it doesn't have powers of control of entry to the profession. I could have joined as an intelligence analyst in one of 50-odd forces at the time. You could become a police officer in a number of new police forces. So if the association has no control over entry, and go back to what we said at the start of the episode, you and I got some theoretical training, and that was checked. You and I had some real-life training, and that was checked. So these clubs don't have the power to do that. So I'm not saying they're useless, but their value, I think, is limited in the fact that they're not as organisationally constrained as, because traditional guilds have control over entry, standards, and exit. These associations do not. The second major problem here, because I do feel that the intel analysis and and analysis more broader, yes, there's some cognitive overlap, and certain cognitive fields don't talk to each other. Yeah, we should talk to banking, and banking should talk to health, and health should talk to education, and education should talk to live. Yeah, and we don't, because we live in silos. But there's also that competition side that you alluded to. There is a very commercialized, people can try and make a name for themselves. They can try and make the career. If they want to basically say, hey, I am the god of intel analysis, and I know lots of stuff. The previous model might have been, cool, get published and your acid test and see how you can get into the national training and see how widely the training goes out there. The other way of doing it is set up an association and you control the barrier to entry and just create a big enough, insiders network where, eventually you get big enough that where you can get a little bit of state control, because maybe you can go to a police force or a municipality and say, for anybody to do this job, they have to do our training or they have to buy our textbook and things like that. And I noticed a lot of that went on. And it was enough to put me off. It was enough to put me off to think, hang on a minute, this isn't about dissemination of information. You described, and it was similar for me. Obviously, I came in after you, but it's still hard for me to get access to sensitive material. So if there was a training intel manual somewhere, the only route I'm going to get that is either if I go on a formal training course by that force or organisation, or if maybe I network with somebody and maybe that person gets permission. But I think here's the big problem, and I think this is the biggest problem facing law enforcement professionalisation bodies in scope of intel and analysis. It's about professional demarcation. Most guilds can say, we know the most about this stuff. We know the most about carpentry. We know the most about medicine. Because we have got modern guilds now, right? So GMC in the UK, guilds, quite rightly, you have to go to medical school and learn a lot, and then you have to kind of be registered with a registered body and that registered body has the ability to remove your license to practice if you fall short of the standards it sets. And quite rightly, we need those guilds. We need that level of professionalisation. The problem with the club side of it is, if the clubs are those barriers to entry, especially when the clubs are marketing themselves as, well, it's intelligence analysis and intelligence the brand, isn't it? It's like, we are the experts on intel. We are the experts on analysts. And the problem is, when you start scratching the surface of the catalogue that says, okay, what's in the intel analysis catalogue? And you find out that it's largely about thought and thinking. And it's almost a kind of a blatant attempt to demarcate professional thinking. So then you're saying, we're the expert thinkers. That's a very bold claim. And it also potentially excludes other people who are not in that group, which I found a little bit of snobbishness in intel analysis. I found a little bit of, here's one that really bugs me, okay? In intelligence analysis, and it was true for you, I think, true for me, but I hear analysts who are very young in service talk about it now, and it's almost this stereotypical fictional detective who is almost like a lumbering idiot, can't think, can't tech, can't think. And it's like, well, you've got to have analysts because, bobbies are one thing, detectives are another thing, analysts are another. And it's like, I've met one or two people like that, but that is not the majority. The majority of detectives I've met, the majority of police officers I've met are very competent people, very professional people, and are often much brighter than I am. And when I come to them and say, well, okay, if they're an inspector or a sergeant tackling a problem, and I say to them, well, okay, I can tell you how to think about this problem because I'm an intel analyst. And I'm trained in whatever kind of flavor of the month policing intel term there is, and there's been a few. That's a difficult sell. It's condescending and it's difficult. And I think that's where some of these things have fallen down, is that sometimes, yes, the clubs have got quite large. The clubs have got a degree of influence. But when you're demarcating thoughts, that's a tough, nobody else is trying to do that. When you look at the other guilds, They're very specific skill sets. Medicine's medicine, and carpentry and forensic science, and they are very specific skills that require specific tools, specific application. But because intel analysis is so cognitive, and this is where I think we're going to get a divisive opinion now, is, I think the reason why intel analysis is dying or hasn't succeeded as it should have done, because think about it, I would put a challenge to every intel analyst or intel manager out there right now. A lot of us have this inbuilt kind of, intel is the way. Intel is the way, and it's, if a lot of organizations would work in the intel way, a lot of things would get solved. Well, I'm sorry if that was the case. I think we'd have seen it by now. We've had decades of people leaving law enforcement and going into the private sector, going to the financial sector, going to other private sectors. Has it taken off? There has been the odd exception. Yeah, of course. There's always an exception that proves the rule. But was intel analysis the data science of the 80s or the 90s, the noughties or the teens? No, it wasn't. Why not? If it's so bloody good, why isn't it been... Is it because it's super secret and only super secret organizations do it? No, because it's been out now for decades. It's an academic... It's taught at degree level now. And so I kind of think, so that's the area you're talking about. There's a twofold problem. You've got that club structure, because it's a club, not a guild. But secondly of all, the core skill set is trying to flog his thinking. And it might be a dressed up form of thinking, but it's thinking. And that's the reason why, one of the reasons why I set up this podcast is because I became very aware in my Intel career that Intel managers, and Carmen said this, director of CIA on a previous episode, we get into this space where we think we have all the skills. We have the secret sauce. It becomes like a wizard's guild of like, our magic is better. But actually, if you think about it, it's a bit like dancing or cooking. There are lots of different schools of dance. There's lots of different schools of cooking. And you may benefit from actually going to lots of different schools and picking up different things. But as you said, we don't. Sorry, go for it.
That's exactly what I would argue. This idea of forming clubs that you're either in or out is exclusionary, and it's contrary to good practice. The very practice of what we do as scientists and information analysts is to go out and collect data from as wide a spectrum as possible and test it for its relevance to our field. And if we didn't do that, we'd stagnate and die. The other side of it is, one of the points you make, and it's a good point, market share. The police services globally are by and large fiefdoms. They have a lot of operational independence at local level to each force. So ultimately, you're negotiating with the heads or the management teams of many different organisations. It's very difficult to take over at a national level. And what you tend to see is, like you said, organisations, and I think academia can be found guilty of this as well in recent years, bending their standards to actually get the business at the expense of their standards. Like you say, professional bodies can't impose these things. The problem with law enforcement, and I'm sure it's the same in elsewhere, but law enforcement is the one I know, law enforcement employees are governed by other standards. As a serving police officer, there was a police code of conduct and legislation in the UK that said, if you do this, you will lose your job or you will be punished. So when I have those versus what a professional body might be saying, my organisation says you will follow the professional standards for police officers. There is in the UK, they are not allowed to have a professional body for police officers or a union. They have something called the Federation. By law, they stop it. The problem with that is, whilst I understand they're wanting to avoid police officers becoming political or biased or to influence that's inappropriate, and I have no problem with that, I agree with it as a societal principle, what it also does is limit you to going through the career development and professional development process for a police officer by what your organisation or your nation says. That's not saying they're close to good practice from elsewhere, but you've got to get them to accept it first before you can do it. I was always very lucky. I would have been less lucky with trying to do it as a police officer, but one of the benefits of intel and analysis being such an underdeveloped function within law enforcement in the UK was it gave me undue influence, even at national level, to be able to stand up and say, well, look, there's some good methodology here that we can cherry pick and poach and turn into things that we feel are of benefit for the UK. So I was able to push those into the UK's own organisational development system at national policing level. Had that been established already, I'll be honest, good, bad or indifferent, I suspect I would have struggled. So that's just kind of an organisational factor. The moment that a professional body says, well, we have to be pragmatic here, we're only going to offer training in this or we'll promote this because we are funded by an IT company or a particular force or a particular organisation, there's a danger of you being dragged into being nothing more than a paid-for rubber stamp. And you can't. I have no issue with businesses, organisations expecting this. They have a different function, a different business model to follow. It's not their fault. It's our fault for sometimes over-compromising. I'm not against some kind of compromise, but there's got to be some red lines somewhere where you say, hang on. The second thing is this issue of tribalism. I'll give you an example. I was in a number of professional bodies that use the phrase intelligence association or intelligence officers. And there were a couple that were for crime analysis, not intelligence analysis. And I sat down with I was a member of both, executive in one, but a member of both. I sat down with the executives of the other one and I said, I'm struggling and I apologise for this, stupid Englishman. What's the difference? Oh, well, we're crime analysts and you're all intelligence analysts. I said, well, I analyse crime all day long. Well, you'd be a member of ours as well. I said, well, I am, but what's the difference? What do you do that's different? Well, we analyse crime. I says, okay, so if you say that your analysts for law enforcement, because they're both law enforcement, start off with a crime report, do you ever look at other information than the crime report? Because if you don't, you're not doing your job properly. Oh, yeah, we look at all sorts. Well, do you look at what we would call information and intelligence, informant reports or other data within the systems of your organisations, even though you might start with the crime reports? Of course we do. Right, so you're crime analysts, but you're doing what we call intelligence analysis. You're just playing with semantics here. And I sat down with them. I said, look at your training. It's the same as ours. Look at your career progression. It's the same as ours. Look at your meetings and the kind of conferences and awards that you have. It's the same as ours. The only difference is in your organisation, you're the president or vice president. And in my organisation, I'm a vice president or whatever, the big grand poobah. And there's only room for one. Is that really a valid reason for having two organisations?
The Treehouse had a great logo, right? That's the main thing.
Well, it was really important to me because this idea of voluntary service, I used to get this, that some people in these organisations would achieve prominence because A, they had very good organisational support, i.e. the organisation would pay for them to attend, they'd pay for them to, and this is flying around the world, they'd give them time off from work to go, even just as a committee member, not just attending a conference, but to go to committee meetings. Yeah, I didn't have that. For me to do anything, I took annual leave, and the force allowed me to have other people pay my expenses, usually the organisation itself or some other body that supported the organisation's work, but I didn't get the money. There was no profit in it. If the plane ticket was $500, that $500 was paid. I never saw a penny of it. So I would be working as a police officer, come up to annual leave when I was supposed to having 2 weeks rest, and I'd be climbing on a plane and flying somewhere in the world and spending the next 2 weeks, instead of basking on a beach and recharging my batteries, working flat out business for the organisation, for the good of the organisation, presenting at conferences, whatever it was, designing, training, meeting with major organisations. Then I'd climb on a plane, fly home, jet lagged to hell, and walk into work the next morning. And of course, all my colleagues would say, oh yeah, you have a great time over there in wherever you've been, 2 weeks on somebody else's money, living it large. And I used to say, I've been grafting my nuts off here. I haven't brought a penny home. My wife and my family hate me because we haven't had a vacation. It's busman's. I didn't go with family, or if I did, I paid for them to go. And it's no fun when your husband and your father's away in a conference 24 and you're twiddling your thumbs in a business hotel room. No, it's not fair on a family. And it was my choice. But people would say to me, well, you can't afford to give up your role. If you resign from all of this, you'll lose all that status. I said, you're joking. Quite apart from the moral and ethical principles that are at stake here, if I give this up, all that's going to happen to me is I'll get my police career back, so I'll be better thought of at work because I'm not disappearing off. I'll have proper holidays and get more sleep. My family will be happier, my wife and my kids. Where's the loss? I don't need to be an official or a member to feel good about myself or to be valued in my workplace. It's actually a detriment to me, where for most of them it wasn't. It was, I might be Joe Average in my home organisation, but in my home employer's organisation, but in this professional body, I'm the grand poobah and I'm a really important person. No, you're not. I mean, I'll give you an example. Another example. Numbers. I've been playing with numbers, these bodies, when they were created and how many members they've got as of today. And if you look, well over half of the current professional bodies around those 4 terms that I searched on have been created in the last 15 years. That's not a creation of professional bodies purely because there's a new need. That's people coming into the marketplace because they see a business opportunity, in my personal opinion. Because they're not new professions. They are, we'll create a professional body to compete with that professional body. We're the new kids on the block. You see what I'm saying? And when you look at them, in my case, as I say, I was at the time I left the organisation that I was vice president of, they had 1,500 members. And the committee would be elected by the members. And the last election that I was involved in, the president, if I remember rightly, was elected with 64 votes. So that's a fraction of the membership could even be bothered to vote. What kind of mandate does that give that person to run an organisation, a global organisation of 1,500? I'm not knocking the individual, but it just shows how people can rise to the top of these organisations with actually very little mandate to do so. And the second thing is that organisation these days has got just over 2,000 members, and the best of luck to it. I wish it nothing but success. Compare it to some of the other professional bodies in our field, if you take the wider view that I'm taking, and it's roughly halfway from the smallest number of members to the highest. The highest number of members I found for one group is 60,000. Can you imagine the power of having 60,000 members as being a voice for a profession and having the logistical support to develop and build a professional body? A big goldfish in one bowl would actually be a very small fish in the sea. And that's again where I see now in practical terms the real limitations of this divide and conquer, or this insular compartmentalisation of we'll represent this niche group so that we create our own little group for specialism without any real reason other than we want to aggrandise our little bit. That's how I see it. I'm sure they're not all like that, and I'm sure they don't start like that, but there's a driver, I would say, a process driver, because of the environment that we all operate in, for this kind of division to lead to not optimal performance in terms of developing professionalism. And if we had a big church, imagine you told me about when you left the police to go to the private sector. So you left the police as one of the most respected and highly skilled analysts in the UK that I know of, and I've seen them globally, so I have my view of your skill set and your value. And you hit the private sector that you should have been able to eat, and I'm sure could, in terms of the tasks that they were giving you, and they had no recognition or value of your skill. So you found it a real struggle. Had you been, or had we all been in the same professional body, a bit like being employed in a big organisation, you could have maybe looked like me as a police officer transferring to be a detective. You could have looked around and thought within the professional body, I want to move from law enforcement into the health sector. What skill sets and what professional information is there for me to transfer my skills across to this area? But there was no professional body link there between the two. Does that make sense?
It does. So we're not saying we don't like trade associations or clubs or guilds. There's absolutely a case for guilds. There's absolutely a case for associations and networks. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that all of the organisations that exist, in order to survive, yes, I've got methodological concerns about intel analysis, but that's quite a niche thing. We can put that to one side. You're right. When I left the police, and I should stress that I didn't want to leave the police, that was a result of budget cuts, and I was forced to leave. If I'd had my way, I'd have been in the police until I'd retired. But that was because, unfortunately, the intelligence arm of UK policing back then was beyond decimated. It was cut by 50%. That's a different story for a different time. What I found was the biggest shock was I was always curious about how other people thought about things, but I always kind of kept it at arm's length when I was in the police. But when I was on the job market trying to get a job, I was just fascinated at how I was deemed to have not very many transferable skills, because different organizations and different industries have their own ways of dealing with data and thinking about things. And when you go into one of those areas, and I've had this in my current job, and I've spoken about it before, and again, apologies to any colleagues of my current organization. You land in an organization, you say, oh, well, I'm trained in this method. And it's like, good for you. What does that mean? Well, it means I can make decisions about things and I can check my thinking and it's a bit more robust. It's like, yeah, we do that. We call it something different. There's plenty of people who come from academic backgrounds, people who come from business intelligence backgrounds, people who come from governance and policy and local gov backgrounds, and they can think critically and do all this stuff. And I think that's where my Intel training and associations have let me down, because I fell into a cognitive trap where I thought, I have this secret sauce. This secret sauce is the only secret sauce. And this secret sauce, once I tell people, they'll be floored by it, it'll be amazing. And that was absolutely arrogant on my part, because when I got there, don't get me wrong, Intel analysis, I think, can support a lot of organizations. But I think because Intel analysis is essentially a largely public sector thing in a very niche context with some very niche information collection and analysis systems behind it. If you go to a private business, if you're selling sports cars or computers or phones or whatever, and some big companies do hire Intel staff. I know some of the super larges, Disney and a few others have got Intel departments, but most don't. Most people, it's a simple fact of life that the majority of professional organizations and people in roles right now, okay, I don't know what the exact stat's going to be, but I would argue, or I'd estimate, that 99% of them don't involve or have any knowledge of Intel analysis. So when you're trying to go from an Intel analysis field and body and everything else into a you don't really stand out. And so and the other thing is, I've also come across different ways of thinking about problems, right? And I talk to a lot of people from economists, the financial sector, talk to a lot of people from public health, military, and they've all got we're back to my analogy of different schools of dancing and cooking, right? They've all got the different ways of cooking. They've all got and cooking being an analogy for thinking. They've all got the different names, different labels, sometimes different practices. But this goes back to a point you made earlier, which is there is a hell of a lot of overlap there. But this is this really weird thing, right? In that you talked about, you had these crime analysts and these Intel analysts saying, we're very different. And you're actually saying, well, actually, if you look deeper, you're actually the same. I actually see that across multiple professional fields. I see that there's, I'm desperate sometimes to try and reach economists or public health people and say, well, actually, there's some overlap. You could learn a little bit from each other, and maybe we could knock off the rough edges of both sides, and maybe there's an underlying thing here that we can look at. It's never going to happen, because you and I have talked about the barriers within the organizational boundary of law enforcement, and they don't talk to each other. Getting separate disciplines to talk to each other, again, happens occasionally, and we've got some very proactive, professional exceptions to the rule. But the rule is the churches don't talk to each other. Never the twain shall meet. And that's the barrier, because I think that's the thing now, is that I'm worried now we're getting into this thing of AI. And what bothers me the most, and this is a speculation, you have to take me a little bit on faith, but if we say, for sake of argument, that AI is only good as its training data, and everything we've ever written, decided, methodological or otherwise, we've got like a law enforcement pot of data, we've got a fintech pot of data, we've got a public health pot of data. I worry about how much bias is getting leaked up if those pots are being treated in isolation. And maybe those pots are being thrown together. Maybe AI is going to pass that and it'll be fine. But what my worry is it turbocharges these perceived silos, and we get even further away from recognizing that different fields should actually have more in common than separate. So that's a bit abstract, but that kind of makes sense.
I completely agree with you. I mean, what reassured me, and you know that I am both a lover and a worrier of new techniques, including AI, and I'm very much an infant in playing with this. It's like the monkey in 2001 playing with the monolith. The tool is far above my simplistic brain cells and ability to deal with it. But when I asked it the questions, and I asked it to look at these fields around those titles, rather than saying law enforcement or some kind of field or geography or UK, I asked it for a philosophical approach as well to Intel information data analysis. And it came up with this very rounded view. And it actually then, playing with it, was able to say, well, I can create you a common set of standards and processes for an intelligence body professional body that would fit any of these fields. And it even built links between them. And I sat watching it thinking, here is this dumb machine trawling all this biased data. Even this machine can see the connectivity and the common ground. For me, visually, I visualize it as kind of a Venn diagram where the overlapping bits are the generic principles and core processes that we all use. And yes, there might be bits outside that Venn diagram that are unique to a particular profession or a particular field. I've no issue with that. But there's far more in that central area or in the overlapping area than people who run these organisations and are members of them might care to think. It's kind of like football supporters or politics. You know, this idea of you're in one tribe or the other. Well, you're all politicians. You're all football supporters. The fact that you support a different team, it's irrelevant. I love Formula One and I follow a particular driver in a particular team. But I have to accept that people who follow other teams are just as interested. They want to watch the same races as me. They want to evaluate the data the same way I do and see people performing the way I do and behaving the way I do. They just support a different team. But we have so much in common, it seems stupid to miss those things. And so for me, I have to re-emphasise, I'm not wanting to beat up on professionals and professionalism. They are a beacon of hope and they're a great place for people. It can be a lonely place in life and in your profession when you're trying to find a way forward and you're not in a group where there are loads of other people and there's a clear path. And careers these days are such that you are likely to change career, to migrate across different organisations or agencies or even professions in your working lifetime. So the more that you can be aware of these things, the more you can, shall we say, have a hopefully more informed choices to make and an understanding of what the options might be. All I would say, and I want to sort of wind it up on this, professional groups can influence, and they do influence, but that influence could be not just positive, but it can also be negative, whether that be intentional or not. There's an imbalance of power. The organisation within itself has a very high level of power. It's got virtually total control over what happens within it. But as we've discussed, externally, they've often got very low levels of power in the environments in which they operate, and that can create tensions. Failing to collaborate impedes their ability to influence. A problem shared is a problem halved. And, you know, two minds are greater than one. You can use whichever aphorism you wish. Common ground is good. Failure to exert control impedes their credibility with stakeholders. If you're not delivering to a certain set of standards, and this could be any organisation, your clients, be it the public, your employers, other organisations, lose faith and trust in you and the whole profession. You know, the old argument of it's just one rotten apple doesn't hold when you've got a profession. It's the profession is flat, be it the banking crisis or some policing problem or some political problem. And finally, individual skills are not the same as professional skills. Highly skilled professionals in a particular profession who are poor leaders will create and lead to poor professional groups because they don't have the skill set around developing and organising and leading or having any kind of leadership function in that group. So just because they are the best in their profession at delivering in their profession, it doesn't make them the best people to run a professional body. And that's quite a difficult circle to square because we tend to look to the best professionals thinking they'll be the best, often than not. So that's it from me. I'll get off my high horse.
It wasn't that high, mate. I'm riding alongside with you.
I look forward to being, the wicker man.
No, I mean, what I would say is I thought it was a great summation. I think we'll make use of that as well in other ones. But you were right. When it get right down to it, we've seen a lot of people sell things that shouldn't be sold, either because they weren't fit for purpose or they were actually belong to everybody anyway, so they shouldn't have been commodified. We've seen people, it's been more about personal career progression than the profession. And we've seen lots of fun and games over many decades. And yes, we want to see an end to that, but obviously there's issues with that. But I think it's never been more important. Me and you talking about the 90s, noughties and early teens and 80s, that's one thing. But I think the why it's now super crucial, I can't stress how crucial this is that you and I in our careers, I think we saw perhaps the peak of the information revolution, the tech, the changes in thinking, the social practices. But I actually think over the next 20 years, we're actually going to see another revolution. I'm not going to say AI and go and be very vague about it. I'll be very explicit. I think we're going to enter what I think of as a decision revolution or a decision-making revolution, where basically decision-making by AI is going to be democratized in the same way that we thought in the 90s and the noughties that access to information was the secret sauce. We just gave everybody everything would fix itself. We're about to go into this automated decision support world where, if we're not careful, the training data that supports all this stuff is going to potentially create a situation where all those flaws in that decision making is going to be baked into everything that we use. To me, this is where all the disciplines need to be talking to each other, basically trying to understand this, not secret source, make it open source. Maybe if you think in a certain way, why? If you have a method, why? And let's get some overlap between the sectors and let's be transparent, let's record it. Because if we don't, I think all this stuff is just going to kind of turbocharge where we've been going, and it's going to cause problems. We're going to have even more bias baked even deeper into data sets, which is super hard to detect, a bit like Mike Hawke said on a previous pod. And now is the time for all people who work with information to assist decision making to get out of their comfort zone and talk to each other and just try and get that overlap and trying to document that because there are kernels of wisdom there. There's logic and reason passes multiple domains, but we need to kind of get that right. So I'll get off my soapbox now and off my high horse. I want to thank everybody for listening. Sorry it's a bit of a longer one today, but it was an important topic that we wanted to talk about. I try to avoid calls to action on the pod, but I have to do it. If you can, either like and subscribe any way you can. But if you don't like, feel free to leave a negative review. Feel free to get in touch. We are super keen on getting engagement with as many people who disagree with us as agree with us. Because as I said before, me and Howard aren't the experts. We could be flat wrong about a lot of the stuff we do. We're just speculating here. If you'd like to be on the pod, get in touch. But I also want to thank all the people that have got in touch and are supporting the pod and being very, very generous in their feedback and praise. So I'll wish everybody safe travels and hopefully we'll get you on the next pod. Howard, anything else you want to say?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
Just one last thing. We've set ourselves up as two people who are on a journey. We've already been, and we're still at different stages, but we're still on a journey through this profession and through this topic area, and we're constantly learning and developing. I certainly am, even though I'm retired from full-time paid employment. This is a message to listeners who are wanting to have a career or have a career and wondering where to go in this profession. And my advice to you is do what Mark and I have done. By all means, join and make use of as many professional bodies that you think will benefit you as possible to inform your decision-making and develop your skill sets. But don't be bound by them. Go outside those bodies, outside any professional bodies, to look anywhere you can for new knowledge and new ideas, and also in other professions or peripheral skills. Don't be limited by the professional bodies that are offered to you for your particular arm of the profession. Because if you do that, you'll get all the benefits of being a member of those bodies without any of the drawbacks or limitations that we believe they can offer to you. So you're more likely to have a more fulfilling career. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be successful financially and everything else, but more fulfilling in terms of developing yourself and your understanding of where we are. And you'll also keep your perspectives more current, wither on the vine and die just because of the limitations placed on you. A bit like a hermit crab. We all outgrow our shells. You will outgrow the shells of particular professional bodies, or you may do, or you may find that they develop as you develop and they're perfect. But focus on number one. Your loyalty is to yourself to develop, and my argument is that's the true mark of a professional, that you actually continue to develop and improve your skill sets and your integrity and your ethics in terms of the service that you provide and the skill set that you offer.
I think that's a perfect wrap up to the pod. Thanks, Howard.
Thank you.